Shiloh and New Orleans. After his western victories, Grant led his troops into southern Tennessee, preparing for an invasion of Mississippi. The Union forces camped on the western bank of the Tennessee River near a small log church named Shiloh. On the morning of April 6, 1862, a Confederate army under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive attack that caught Grant's army off guard. The fierceness of the Confederate assault, accompanied by the wild rebel yell, caused thousands of Union soldiers to break ranks and rush in panic toward the river. Others stood their ground and fought. In the words of an observing journalist, the light of the sun was obscured by the clouds and smoke, and the ground became moist and slippery with human gore. The battle raged all day. Early in the afternoon, Johnston, the Confederate commander, was shot through the leg by a bullet that severed an artery. He bled to death, still trying to direct the assault. Despite the loss of Johnston, the Southerners went on to push the Union troops back for a full 2 miles. At nightfall, the new Confederate commander ordered his troops to rest, confident that he had defeated Grant and that he could mop up any remaining resistance on the following day. But Grant had been expecting reinforcements, and they arrived in the hours after the Southern attack subsided. Overnight, confident that he had defeated Grant and that he could mop up any remaining resistance on the following day. But Grant had been expecting reinforcements, and they arrived in the hours after the Southern attack subsided. Overnight, Grant's army swelled with 25,000 fresh troops. His force now significantly outnumbered the Confederates. In the morning, it was Grant's turn to launch a surprise attack. The fighting on the battle's second day was equally ferocious, but this time it was the Confederates who fell back, retreating into Mississippi. In the 2 days of the Battle of Shiloh, both armies combined suffered more than 20,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The death toll amounted to 3,477 men. Years later, when he wrote his memoirs, Grant remembered that the intensity of the Confederates' fighting spirit led him to conclude that the Union could only be saved by the complete conquest of the South. The butchery at Shiloh ended romantic illusions the war would be short and thrilling. After the battle, General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of Grant's division commanders, observed piles of dead soldiers' mangled bodies and commented, "The scenes on this field would have cured anybody of war." Shortly after the Battle of Shiloh, the North scored another significant victory. Union warships commanded that David Farragut seize the port city of New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. The Union now controlled a major port of entry to the river. One of the main elements to the so-called Anaconda Plan had been to squeeze the South by gaining control of this important waterway. With Farragut's victory, the Union controlled the lower Mississippi and had a base from which to attack the deep South. The Peninsula Campaign and Second Bull Run. While Grant won victories for the Union in Tennessee, General McClellan continued to train and equip the Army of the Potomac. McClellan proved skillful at organizing an army, but not so eager to fight with one. Lincoln expected the general to launch a new invasion of Virginia and drive toward Richmond, but McClellan constantly found excuses not to advance. His plans were not finished, his troops were not ready, the rebel forces in northern Virginia were too numerous. Exasperated, Lincoln remarked, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for the time." Finally, in March 1862, McClellan set his huge army in motion, but instead of marching them into northern Virginia, he transported his troops by ship to the peninsula between the York and James rivers in the southeastern corner of the state. McClellan intended to advance on the Confederate capital Richmond from the south. Even after landing, however, McClellan was reluctant to attack. Vastly overestimating the size of the forces opposing him, he moved so slowly and hesitantly that another Union general took to calling him the Virginia Creeper. As McClellan delayed, Confederate troops prepared to defend Richmond. McClellan expected reinforcements to come from the Shenandoah Valley to the west, but the Union troops there were tied down by the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, the hero of Bull Run. A brilliant military tactician, Jackson was also a fervently religious man who believed that his troops constituted an army of the living God. He drove his men on on pushing forced marches that enabled them to move with astonishing speed and catch their northern opponents by surprise. Meanwhile, McClellan's massive army lumbered slowly toward Richmond. By the end of May, Union forces were within 5 miles of the city. In what turned out to be a stroke of luck for the Confederacy, the Confederate commander was wounded and replaced by General Robert E. Lee, who vowed, "Richmond shall not be given up." In a week of bloody fighting, Lee battered McClellan's army and drove it back from the city. Blaming the failure to take Richmond on McClellan's timidity, Lincoln replaced him with General John Pope. Like McClellan, Pope proved to be no match for Lee. The Confederate general seized the initiative, sending his army north, where it defeated Pope's troops at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee's army now stood poised within 20 miles of Washington. Northerners were deeply discouraged by news of these defeats. When Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 new volunteers, few men came forth. The U.S. Sanitary Commission. Twice as many Civil War soldiers died of disease as from combat wounds. Crowded together in camps with bad sanitation and foul water, soldiers succumbed to dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, pneumonia, or malaria. To address this problem, early in the war, thousands of volunteers, many of them women, and most veterans of reform causes like temperance, women's suffrage, and abolitionism, formed local soldiers' aid societies. Under the leadership of Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, and Henry Bellows, a Unitarian minister, they convinced the Lincoln administration to establish the United States Sanitary Commission. Though the group's leaders were men, most of its several thousand volunteers were women. Known popularly as the Sanitary, the Commission's corps of civilian doctors, nurses, and agents worked to improve camp conditions and treat wounded soldiers. Their efforts were limited by the current state of medical knowledge. Physicians had not yet learned how to treat wounds with antiseptics or kill bacteria with antibiotics. Antietam, whatever. Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered Lee to invade the North. Winning a battle on northern soil might convince a sufficient number of Democrats and moderate Republicans that it was time to let the South go its own way. It might also win support from Britain and the other European powers. Just as Southerners hoped, many in the North were growing weary of war. Northerners were suffering under war-related inflation, taxes, and military conscription. Conscription is required enrollment, especially in military service. Both the Confederacy and the Union enacted draft laws, the first in American history. Lee did not intend to capture and hold Northern territory, but he was willing to gamble that a decisive blow well inside the Union would force Lincoln to negotiate for peace. With this objective in mind, the beginning of September 1862, Lee led his troops across the Potomac River. He entered Maryland to the west of Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Lincoln relieved the ineffective Pope of his command and reluctantly put McClellan back in charge of the Army of the Potomac. On September 17th, the two armies fought a bloody battle on the banks of Antietam Creek. McClellan's forces stopped Lee's advance and forced his army to withdraw to Virginia. The total number of soldiers killed or mortally wounded on both sides exceeded 6,000, making September 17, 1862 the bloodiest single day in American history. The terrible carnage on both sides at Antietam, as in other battles of the Civil War, was partially the result of old-fashioned military tactics that failed to take account of new weaponry. As they had for at least a century, these tactics worked when the main infantry weapon was a smoothbore musket that had a short range and was difficult to load. But during the Civil War, the smoothbore musket was largely replaced by the rifle with a grooved barrel that gave a spin to the bullet as it flew through the air, thus hugely increasing both the range and the accuracy of shots. Troops advancing in close order were easily mowed down by rifle fire. After the victory at Antietam, Lincoln expected McClellan to pursue Lee into Virginia and crush the rebel army. But once more, McClellan hesitated because of his fear of the enemy's numbers. It took him 6 weeks to order his men across the Potomac. Lincoln fired McClellan again, this time for good. The humiliated general now became a bitter political enemy of the president. Striking at slavery. At the outset of the Civil War, most Northerners sought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Lincoln shared this general view. He had always considered slavery an unqualified evil. But as a moderate Republican, he initially pursued a policy of containment rather than abolition. He believed that if slavery were restricted to the southern states, it would inevitably die out. In his first inaugural address, he promised not to interfere with the slavery in the states where it already existed. He pledged only to stop its spread into the western territories. As the Civil War ground on, however, Lincoln changed his view, in large part because of actions taken by slaves themselves. Wherever Union armies went, slaves escaped from their masters and sought refuge with the soldiers. In March 1862, Congress enacted an article of war forbidding Union commanders from returning fugitive slaves to their masters. Instead, Union officers treated the runaways as contraband and put them to work in army camps. Lincoln and other moderate Republicans came to realize that freed slaves were an important source of manpower for the North. Lincoln was also sensitive to world opinion on the issue of slave. Oh my goodness. Lincoln was also sensitive to world opinion on the issue of slavery. If Europeans believed that the North was fighting for a nobler cause than self-preservation, they might withhold support for the Confederacy. Lincoln especially needed to ensure the neutrality of Great Britain, since some British leaders wanted to intervene on the side of the South in order to keep southern cotton flowing to British textile mills. Britain had freed all the slaves in its empire a generation before. Its citizens were largely opposed to slavery. Lincoln knew that if he emancipated the American slaves, he might tip the balance of public opinion in England and prevent the British government from officially recognizing the Confederacy. Lincoln's moral beliefs combined with his sense of military necessity to push him toward a new position. In July 1862, he told two of his cabinet members, "We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued." But many residents of the border states resisted calls for emancipation. For the time being, Lincoln did not feel he could shift his policy. The Emancipation Proclamation. After he decided that it had become necessary to end slavery for both military and moral reasons, Lincoln waited for the right time to act. On the eve of the Battle of Antietam, he told himself that if Lee's army could be driven out of Maryland, it would be a sign that God had decided the question in favor of the slaves. About a week after the victory at Antietam, Lincoln announced his intention to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, an order granting freedom to all enslaved persons in the Confederacy. The Confederates had until January 1st, 1863 to lay down their arms. If they failed to do so, then on that date, according to Lincoln's order, all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforth and forever free. Incidentally, the main effect of the Emancipation Proclamation was more symbolic than real. It did not immediately liberate a single slave. In order to retain their loyalty to the Union, the border states were exempt from the proclamation. Lincoln's order did not apply to parts of the South occupied by Union troops. It only freed slaves in the areas controlled by the Confederacy, where Lincoln had no authority. Thus, some abolitionists criticized the proclamation as an ineffective gesture. Most abolitionists, however, echoed Frederick Douglass, who wrote, We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree." Douglass realized that the proclamation would turn the Union Army into a force for liberation, ending slavery as the Army conquered the South. The Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally changed the meaning of the war. Before the proclamation, a Northern victory over the South meant only that slavery would not be extended into the territories. After the proclamation, victory meant the destruction of slavery in all the Confederate states. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln formally issued his Emancipation Proclamation. Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty men. Lincoln's political opponents in the North were almost as hostile. Many conservative Democrats who had supported the war while had a limited aim of preserving the Union now became peace Democrats. A Democratic newspaper warned that Lincoln was adrift on a current of radical fanaticism. Lincoln himself had no doubt the Emancipation Proclamation dramatically transformed the goals of the war. He wrote that the character of the world will be changed. It will be one of subjugation. The South is to be destroyed and replaced by new propositions and ideas. From the Emancipation Proclamation. When the Civil War began, Lincoln was intent on preserving the Union at all costs, even if slavery survived in some form. But the Emancipation Proclamation recast the Civil War as one against slavery. Late in the war, looking back on the course of events, Lincoln remarked to a friend that the Emancipation Proclamation was the central event of my administration and the greatest event of the 19th century. Now I, therefore, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time for actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states, in rebellion against the United States, and parts of states are and henceforth shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless it is necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that, in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Early in the Civil War, thousands of black men wanted to fight for the Union cause, but the Union Army would not accept blacks. Frederick Douglass expressed his disbelief that the Union leaders would refuse to receive the very class of men which has a deeper interest in the defeat and humiliation of the rebels than all others. Such is the pride, the stupid prejudice and folly that rules the hour. The Emancipation Proclamation, however, took the bold step of authorizing the enlistment of freed slaves and free blacks. African Americans eagerly volunteered to serve the Union cause. Frederick Douglass himself helped organize the first black regiment in the U.S. Army, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The regiment was commanded by a white abolitionist, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and included in its ranks two of Douglass's sons. At first, because many in the army doubted the fighting ability of blacks, the 54th was restricted to garrison duty, but Shaw insisted on leading his men into combat. In July 1863, the 54th launched a heroic assault on Fort Wagner, a nearly impenetrable stronghold on the coast of South Carolina. Through heavy fire, the regiment managed to make it to the fort's entrance, where Sergeant William Carney, a former slave, planted the American flag, an action for which he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. The fort finally proved too strong to be taken, and the 54th Regiment suffered heavy casualties. After the fort on Fort Wagner, however, there could no longer be any doubt about the courage of black soldiers. The following year, the 54th fought with equal skill at the Battle of Ossipee in Florida. Over the course of the war, some 880,000 African Americans would serve the Union in uniform. Their bravery compelled many whites to reconsider their long-held ideas about race and citizenship. Vicksburg and Gettysburg. By 1863, both North and South were suffering. The era of festive enthusiasm that marked the beginning of the war had long since disappeared. What remained on each side was a mix of grim determination, numb exhaustion, and sometimes bitter rage. The siege of Vicksburg. In the west, Ulysses Grant, commanding the Army of West Tennessee, continued to battle Confederate forces for control of the Mississippi River. By the spring of 1863, the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the lone rebel stronghold remaining on the river. After trying and failing to seize Vicksburg by force, Grant laid siege to it, planning to starve the city into submission. As the siege wore on, Vicksburg inhabitants were reduced to eating the meat of mules, dogs, even rats. One soldier noted that fried rats had a flavor fully equal to that of squirrels. Finally, after 6 weeks of siege, with his soldiers sick, starving, and mutinous, the Confederate commanders surrendered. It was July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. The bitter citizens of Vicksburg would refuse to celebrate Independence Day again until the outbreak of World War II. With the Mississippi under Union control, Lincoln rejoiced. The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. The Battle of Gettysburg. While Vicksburg was under siege, an even more momentous battle took place in the east. With the Confederate forces losing in the west, Robert E. Lee decided that only bold action could save the Southern cause. In June 1863, he launched a second invasion of the North, intending to remove the pressure on Virginia and shatter Northern morale. This time, Lee planned to strike into southern Pennsylvania, attacking Harrisburg and Philadelphia. The Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George Meade, marched north to meet Lee in the summer heat. The two armies met in the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The battle began on July 1st and raged for 3 days. On the first day, Confederate troops seized Gettysburg, forcing the Union forces on the hills outside the town, Cemetery Bridge, Big Round Top, and Little Round Top. On the second day, the rebels set out to seize the hills. After taking Big Round Top, Lee sent wave after wave of soldiers up Little Round Top, which was defended by an outnumbered but tenacious regiment from Maine. As the regiment ran out of ammunition, its colonel led his men in a ferocious bayonet charge down the hill, which set the Confederates running like a herd of wild cattle. When night fell the second day, the Union line had held, but the confident Lee believed that he could win by launching a final devastating assault. The next day, against the advice of his officers, Lee ordered an attack on the Union center of Cemetery Ridge. Estimates vary, but reliable accounts report that about 13,000 rebels advanced across open ground toward Meade's Union troops, who, sheltered by a stone wall, poured fire down on them. A Confederate officer remembered the hopeless courage of his troops. Men were falling all around us, and cannon and muskets were raining death upon us. Still, on and up the slope toward that stone fence our men steadily swept. Only a small group of rebels reached the wall, where most of them died in vicious hand-to-hand fighting. Of the Confederate troops who made what became known as Pickett's Charge, after General George Pickett, one of its leaders, more than half were either killed or wounded. The next day, one Union officer reported that he tried to ride over the field, but could not, for dead and wounded lay too thick to guide a horse through them. Yeesh. The failure of Pickett's charge ensured a Union victory, but the losses at Gettysburg were staggering on both sides, with 23,000 Union and 28,000 Confederate soldiers killed or wounded. Lee retreated to Virginia, accepting full responsibility for the defeat and offering his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who refused to accept it. Offering his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who refused to accept it. The Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg were major turning points in the war. In the west, the Mississippi was closed to Confederate trade. In the east, Lee's army was vastly depleted. But the Confederate government was a long way from giving up the fight. The New York City draft riots. In the north, the war effort was breeding dissension. Shortly after Gettysburg, mobs in New York City rioted in protest against a newly instituted draft. The riots also took on an ugly racist dimension. What led to this draft rising? Though it enjoyed economic advantages, the North also struggled to meet the burdens of the Civil War. Citizens resented the new taxes levied by the government, and many soldiers opposed the draft laws, which allowed rich men the opportunity to avoid military service by paying a $300 fee. Working-class families also bore the brunt of rising food and clothing costs. Many workers, Irish immigrants in particular, supported the Democratic Party. They were hostile to blacks and had no desire to fight in a war that would free the slaves. In July 1863, thousands of angry working men in New York, mostly Irish, staged a riot to protest these conditions. Aiming their fury at African Americans and wealthy whites, whom they viewed as responsible for the war, they attacked and murdered dozens of black men and women, even going so far as to burn down a black orphanage. It took the Union Army, including several divisions that had just finished fighting at Gettysburg, to quell the rioting. The New York City draft riots, as the uprising was called, provided a chilling reminder that not everyone in the North supported the war. The Gettysburg Address. On November 19, 1863, at the dedication of the battlefield cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Lincoln's 2-minute dedicatory remarks followed a 2-hour speech by the Honorable Edward Everett, a brilliant orator and former congressman, senator, governor, and president of Harvard University. Coming after so long a speech, with a crowd of about 15,000 eager to depart from the cemetery, Lincoln's remarks seemed destined to the back pages of history, but the nation, and then the world, responded to his eloquence. Edward Everett wrote to Lincoln, "I wish that I could flatter myself that I'd come as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." The Gettysburg Address. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to speak at the dedication of a military cemetery for those killed in the recent battle. He was not the keynote speaker that day. That honor belonged to Edward Everett, a former Massachusetts senator. Everett's oration, typical for the time, was formal and long. He spoke for 2 hours. President Lincoln had committed to deliver only a few brief remarks. In a speech of just 2 minutes, he began with these words: "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Score is an Old English term meaning 20. In effect, Lincoln dated the nation's founding to 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, not 1787, the year when the Constitution was written. This was an important though subtle point. For many years, abolitionists had publicly stated a preference for the Declaration of Independence over the Constitution. They preferred the Declaration because it declared that all men are created equal, while the Constitution contained the dreaded 3/5 compromise and gave official recognition to the international slave trade. If abolitionists preferred the Declaration of Independence, many conservative and modern thinkers held up the Constitution as the most important document in American history. It embodied a spirit of compromise and moderation. Northern Democrats during the war often called for restoring the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is. In other words, in their view, the limited goal of the war was to bring the Southern states back into the Union without fundamentally altering the nation's laws or traditions. Lincoln had broken with the conservative position when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in his Gettysburg Address, as his brief remarks are called, Lincoln gave new meaning to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. He reminded his listeners that the Founding Fathers had created a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln was implying that the meaning of all men had changed to include African Americans as well. He concluded by honoring the memory of the fallen Union soldiers and asking Americans to resolve that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. While the Civil War had started as a limited engagement to preserve the Union, it had evolved into a larger struggle to redefine and broaden American democracy, as set forth in Lincoln's immortal words at Gettysburg. There, I hope that wasn't too bad, and yeah.